He found out his wife had cheated on him, and he decided that now all women owed him something. It sounds like another scandalous Instagram post about relationships. Men can't be trusted. All women are the same. She cheated, so somehow the entire female gender is to blame. But this is not an Instagram post. This story is more than 1,000 years old. King Shahryar discovered his wife's infidelity. He was betrayed, he was humiliated, and instead of punishing the people actually responsible, he came to a conclusion that we can still hear today after a painful breakup. So they are all the same. After that, Shahryar decided to solve the problem in the most radical way possible. Every evening he took a new wife, and every morning she was executed. Not one of these women had cheated on him. Many of them didn't even have time to do anything at all. Their only crime was that they were women, and their king had already decided that sooner or later they would betray him. And this is where 1001 Nights begins, because one woman looked at this man, the most powerful man in the kingdom, a man who could have her killed with a single word, and said, I will go to him myself. Her name was Scheherazade. She didn't come with an army, she didn't start a revolution, even wasn't planning to kill the king. She decided to do something far more dangerous. She was going to make him listen. Night after night, story after story, and the central question of this book is surprisingly modern. Does a person have the right to hate all women because of one woman? And can personal trauma ever justify cruelty toward people who have done absolutely nothing wrong? Because 1001 Nights isn't simply a collection of stories about genies and magic labs. It's the story of a man who decided he had figured women out, and of a woman who spent 1001 nights proving him wrong. If you enjoy literary analysis, make sure to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your friends, that way you'll help elevate their literary taste and help the channel grow as well. You are watching RobertBooks. Let's begin! The man who declared war on all women. The story doesn't begin with Scheherazade, and that matters. Because before we can understand why only one woman would voluntarily go to a man who had been killing his wives, we need to understand how Shahryar himself became that man. King Shahryar had a brother named Shah Zaman. Both were powerful rulers, but one day Shahryar decided to visit his brother and sent a messenger to summon him. Shah Zaman was already preparing to leave when, just before his departure, he returned to his chambers to retrieve something he had forgotten. And there he saw something that had changed the entire story. His wife was with another man. Shah Zaman killed them both, but the killing brought him no relief. He went to his brother looking gloomy, devastated, and almost completely unresponsive to everything happening around him. Shahryar tried to understand what was wrong, but his brother remained silent, and then came the second blow. While Shahryar was away hunting, Shah Zaman looked out from the palace window and saw Shahryar's own wife secretly meeting with her lovers, along with members of her entourage. More importantly, the story deliberately makes it clear that was not some random incident, okay, or a single mistake. Shah Zaman witnesses an entire secret scene and realizes that his brother is living under the same illusion he himself had been living under only recently. When Shahryar learns the truth, his reaction is even more terrifying than the betrayal itself. He orders his wife and the others involved to be killed, But he doesn't stop there. And this is the crucial moment. Instead of concluding, my wife betrayed me, he concludes, no women can ever be trusted. That is no longer revenge against specific people. It is personal trauma being turned into an ideology. Shahryar decides to marry a new girl every evening, spend the night with her, and have her executed the following morning, before she supposedly has the chance to betray him. In other words, he begins punishing women for a crime they have not committed and may never have committed. Their sentences are handed down in advance, and what makes it even more horrifying is that the killing becomes a state-run system. The vizier is responsible for finding new brides for king. Fathers understand that giving their daughter in marriage to the ruler is essentially sending her to her death. Families live in terror. Girls disappear one after another, and this is where 1001 Nights suddenly becomes a story that feels remarkably modern. Because Shahryar is doing something people do when they turn personal pain into a universal rule. I was betrayed, therefore everyone is a traitor. I was deceived, therefore no one can be trusted. One woman hurt me, therefore all women are like that. The only difference is that Shahryar had the power of a king. He wanted pride becomes deadly for completely innocent people. And this is the moment when the central question of the entire story emerges. Who can stop a man who believes he is not the villain but the victim? Because Shahryar is convinced that he is not committing a crime in his mind. He is simply protecting himself from being betrayed again. That means that defeating him is not as simple as telling him, you are a monster. Someone has to make him see the world differently. And very soon, a woman will attempt to do exactly that. A woman who will voluntarily enter his palace, fully aware that she may never live to see the next morning. Scheherazade voluntarily goes to the man who is supposed to kill her. And now Scheherazade enters the story. And from the very beginning, her decision seems almost insane. She is not some random girl who is captured and brought before the king. She is not a helpless victim who doesn't understand what is happening. Quite the opposite. Scheherazade is the daughter of the vizier, the very man who, by the Shahryar's order, is forced to find new wives for him. She knows exactly what is happening inside the palace. She knows that girls are disappearing one after another. She knows that marrying him no longer means wealth, power, and a happy life. Now it's essentially a death sentence that takes effect in the following morning. And that is precisely why her decision sounds so insane. Scheherazade herself tells her father that she wants to become Shahryar's wife. The vizier is horrified. He cannot understand why his daughter would voluntarily go to a place from which no woman ever returns. But Scheherazade is not simply a brave girl who has decided to make a noble sacrifice. In the traditional frame story, she says that she wants either to put an end to the king's cruelty toward women or die alongside them. In other words, she understands the price of her decision before she ever makes it. Her father tries to talk her out of it, and he doesn't rely only on orders and threats. He begins telling her a story, the famous tale of the ox and the donkey. And this is a very important moment, because 1001 Nights establishes its central principle right here. When ordinary worlds fail, people start telling stories. The vizier hopes that the story will frighten his daughter and make her abandon her plan. But Scheherazade does not change her mind. She asks her father to grant her request. And here we arrive at a question that would probably explode the comments on Instagram today. What does a person do when someone else has complete power over their life? Scheherazade cannot order the king to stop, she cannot raise an army, she cannot defeat Shahryar physically. Well, she can try, at least. She enters his palace with virtually no weapon at all, but she has something the king does not yet recognize as a weapon: intelligence, education, memory, and the ability to tell stories. In the traditional collection, Scheherazade is described as exceptionally well educated, knowledgeable in stories, legends, poetry, and much more. And judging by what happens next, she doesn't go to the Shahryar simply hoping for a miracle. She has a plan. Her youngest sister, Dunyazade, plays an important role in that plan. Scheherazade asks her sister in advance to come to her before dawn and ask her for tell a story. Everything has to appear completely natural. The young bride is simply fulfilling her sister's final request. But in reality, we are witnessing the beginning of an operation in which more than Shahrazade's life depends. On her first night, as the king's wife, she lies beside a man who has already sent an unknown number of women to their death. And instead of trying to escape or begging for mercy, she prepares to do something completely different. She is going to seize the most valuable thing she has, the king's attention. Because Shahryar controls her body, her position, and her life, but Scheherazade is going to try to control the story. And very soon it will become clear that a man who can order anyone's death is completely powerless in the face of one simple question: what happens next? The first night, how she stopped death with one unfinished story. The first night arrives. Scheherazade already knows that she may be dead by morning, so her first move has to be perfect. She asks Shahryar to allow her sister Dunyazad to come to her. So sister arrives and says, "My dear sister, tell us a story to make the night more pleasant." Scheherazade asks the king for permission and begins to tell her story, and this is where the central miracle of the entire frame story takes place. Not a genie, not a magic lamp, not a spell, but an ordinary story becomes a weapon against a death sentence. Scheherazade tells a story that gradually captures Shahryar's attention. But she doesn't finish it before dawn. Morning arrives, and the most interesting part is still ahead. Shahryar does not order her execution. Why? Because he wants to hear the rest. This is the crucial point. Scheherazade has not won her freedom, okay? She has not defeated the king, and she has not convinced him to abandon his cruelty after a single night. She has achieved only one thing: she has bought herself a delay. But sometimes a delay is where victory begins. The next night she continued the story and then begins another one. Once again dawn approaches, and once again the story remains unfinished. This creates the mechanism that ultimately produces the entire structure of 1001 Night. Death is supposed to come in the morning, but every morning there is a reason to wait one more night. And the most interesting thing is not simply that Scheherazade tells stories. She gradually changes the balance of power between herself and the king. Formally, Shahryar is still in control. He can still order her execution. But now he needs something from her. He needs her stories. And the longer the storytelling continues, the more dependent the king becomes on what has not yet been told. Think about how absurd the situation is. A man who is accustomed to deciding people's fates with a single command keeps postponing an execution every morning because he wants to know what happens next. It is almost a perfect literally mockery of absolute power. Shahryar can force a woman to come to his palace, but he cannot force her story to end when it suits him. Scheherazade turns her own deadly situation into a deadly series, with the executioner himself as its main viewer. And there is another important point. She doesn't lecture the king. She doesn't tell him you are wrong. She doesn't give him a political speech about women's rights, okay? She does something much subtler. She forces him night after night to see the world through other people's eyes. Every new story shows him people who love, betray, make mistakes, suffer, deceive, forgive, take revenge, and save one another. Gradually, his original belief that all women can be considered guilty in advance collides with an enormous number of human stories, and this is Scheherazade's real strategy. To stop a man who has stopped seeing women as individual human beings, she begins telling him about human beings. 1001 Nights is not 1001 attempts to beg for mercy. It's 1001 nights during which a man accustomed to passing judgment is forced to listen to other people's stories. And this is and it all begins with one simple rule: as long as the story is unfinished, morning can wait. Sex, infidelity, and the fear of women. Shahryar's deepest wound is infidelity. That is where his hatred began, and that's why the Scheherazade stories keep returning to the question he is trying to solve in the most primitive way possible. Can a woman ever be trusted? In the frame story, after Shahryar discovers his wife's betrayal, he becomes convinced that female infidelity is inevitable. And this is where the collection begins playing rather brutally with his fear. The stories repeatedly feature love affairs, secret relationships, jealousy, deception, and desire. But at the same time, they show just how different people can be. In one story, a woman be unfaithful, and another she may be loyal. One man becomes the victim of deception, another turns out to be the deceiver himself. So Shahryar's simple formula begins to fall apart. You cannot take a handful of stories and turn them into a law of nature. There is a very modern relationship problem at the heart of this. A person experiences betrayal and instead of saying I was betrayed says all men are like that or all women are like that. Shahryar takes this logic to a monstrous extreme. He doesn't wait for another betrayal. He punishes someone in advance for a crime they have not even committed. And these stories themselves, women are far from always being portrayed as helpless. Some use cunning, some deceive men, and some turn out to be smarter than those who are convinced of their own superiority. That is particularly uncomfortable for Shahryar. He is used to believing that power automatically means control, while the stories repeatedly show him the opposite. Money, status, strength, and authority do not guarantee a person love, loyalty, or even the truth. A husband may believe his wife belongs to him and have absolutely no idea what is happening behind his back. A wealthy man can be deceived by someone poor. A powerful man can become a pawn in the hands of someone he considers weaker than himself. That's why the erotic and romantic stories in 1001 Nights matter as more than simply provocative episodes. They constantly test the boundary between desire and power. Who owes what to whom? Does a wife have to be faithful simply because she's a wife? Can a husband demand absolute obedience? What happens when someone treats love as a form of ownership? Shahryar answered this question with violence, Scheherazade answered them with stories. And the more he listens, the harder it becomes for him to maintain his original view of the world. The most interesting part is that she does not try to prove that women are always innocent, okay? That would be too easy. She shows people as the collection itself shows them. Contradictory, cunning, passionate, noble, greedy, cruel, different. That is precisely why her strategy works. To destroy the belief that all women are the same, you do not have to prove that all women are good. You only have to show that they are different. Shahryar wanted to reduce half of humanity to single accusation, and every night Scheherazade gives back what he had taken away from his victims, their individuality. And perhaps that's why her stories gradually becomes more dangerous than any direct confrontation. The Merchant and the Jinn, when a good story is worth more than a life. One of Shahrazade's first major stories begins with an ordinary man, a merchant who is traveling on business and stops to rest along the way. While taking a break, he casually throws away a date pit and never imagining that this insignificant act will become the reason for a death sentence. A jinn suddenly appears before him and declares that the merchant has killed his son by throwing the pit. The merchant tries to explain himself, but the jinn demands his death. And this is where one of the strangest courtroom scenes in the entire collection begins. A man is supposed to die because of an action whose consequences he could never have known. The merchant asks for a delay so that he can return home, put his affairs in order, and say goodbye to his family. The jinn agrees to wait. And as a year later, the merchant returns to the same place, essentially walking voluntarily to the spot where he is supposed to be killed. The three old men, like wise men, maybe, appear. Each of one sees the merchant despair and decides to try to save him. But they have no army, no weapons, no power over the jinn. All they have are stories. The first old man makes a deal with the jinn. If his story is extraordinary enough, the jinn will give up a third of his claim and spare a third of the merchant's life. The second offers the same bargain. The third once again offers a story in exchange for the merchant's life. And this is where 1001 Nights seems to explain its own rules. A story is not decoration and it's not entertainment. It becomes a form of legal currency. A story has a price. The more extraordinary the story, the more a person can receive in return. And the most interesting part is that the jinn, despite possessing enormous power, accepts these rules. He could simply kill the merchant and three old men, but instead he listens. Why? Because a story is capable of captivating even a supernatural being. And that's why connects this tale to Scheherazade herself. She is in almost exactly the same situation, except her jinn is the king. She is too physically weaker than the person who holds her life in his hands. She cannot defeat him through force. And she too buys time by telling story. The only difference is their scale. The old men are trying to win the merchant alive more time, a little more time, while Scheherazade turns a single postponement into 1001 nights. This contains one of the most powerful ideas in the entire collection. A story can stop a person even when that person believes the verdict has already been decided. More than that, the listener willingly participates in his own discernment. All it takes is the desire to know how the story ends, and while he listens, the person whose life is stake gets a little more time. That's why the scene with the merchant and the jinn is not just a random fairy tale buried inside a huge collection. It's almost a miniature version of the frame story itself. There is a person who has been sentenced, there is a powerful judge, there is a death that's supposed to happen, and there is a storyteller who says, wait, first hear me out. And that's exactly how Scheherazade will survive night after night. Not because the king has suddenly become kind, but because he keeps wanting to hear what happens next. The fisherman and the jinn. Why the person you save can become your killer. The story of the fisherman and the jinn presents an even harsher version of one of the central rules of 1001 Nights. Doing good does not guarantee gratitude, okay? A poor fisherman casts his net and instead of fish pulls up several completely worthless objects. Finally, his net catches a brass vessel sealed with a seal. The fishermen decide to open it, hoping there might be something valuable inside. A huge cloud of smoke bursts out of the vessel and transforms into a genie. And this is where things take a pleasant turn. The genie has no intention of thanking the man for freeing him. Quite the opposite, he announces that he intends to kill the fisherman. And he has his own story to explain why. Long ago, he was imprisoned inside the vessel and at first decided that he would reward whoever eventually freed him. But after centuries of imprisonment, his thinking changed. Now he intends to kill the very person who saved him. The fisherman realized that arguing with a creature physically far more powerful than himself is pointless. So he does what repeatedly saves the weak in this collection. He starts thinking. He expresses doubt that such an enormous gene could possibly have fit inside such a small vessel. The gene takes this challenge to his pride and demonstrates his ability by turning back into smoke and returning inside the vessel. The fisherman immediately seals it shut and throws it back into the sea. And that's the entire victory. No strength, not courage in battle, and not some magical weapon. The fisherman simply made his opponent feel compelled to prove his own words. And this is the very important detail throughout our book. Again and again, the winner is not the person with the most power, but the person who understands the situation better. The gene may be a giant, but he has a pride. The fisherman is weak, but he knows how to use the pride against its owner. And once again, we come back to Scheherazade. She is in much the same position as the fisherman. Shahryar is more powerful than she in virtually every conventional sense. He's a king, he has armed men, servants, wealth, and the authority to order an execution. But Scheherazade understands one of his weaknesses. He wants to listen. So she does not try to defeat him on his own terms. She does not argue with the king about who is stronger. She makes him to do something he never intended to do. Wait, listen, and want to hear what comes next. That's the paradox at the heart of the collection. On the surface, there are stories about powerful kings, genies, sorcerers, and wealthy men. But again and again, they become dependent on people they consider weaker than themselves. The genie ends up trapped inside the vessel because of the fisherman's cleverness. The king becomes dependent on the stories of a woman he intended to kill, and gradually it becomes clear that the real magic of 1001 Nights is not supernatural at all. It's the ability to recognize the weakness in someone who appears unbeatable. The fisherman saves his life with a single trick. Scheherazade is going to do the same thing, except her vessel will be a story. And instead of buying herself a few moments, she will need 1001 nights. Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph who leaves the palace at night. In 1001 Nights, Harun al-Rashid does not appear as a single hero with one complete biography, but as a recurring character in many different stories. And almost always the same tempting scenario surrounds him. The great ruler wants to see what is happening beyond the walls of his palace, so he goes out at night, often in disguise, accompanied by his trusted companions. On paper, he has almost everything: power, wealth, army, and the authority to pass judgment. But then why does he have to hide his identity in order to discover the truth? Because palace life and real life are two completely different things. When the Caliph is present, people know how they are supposed to behave. They are respectful, cautious, and careful to say only what's safe to say in front of the ruler. At night, however, Harun may find himself among people who have no idea what they are speaking to the most powerful man in the city. And this is where the collection begins to play with them of power. The ruler wants to judge other people, but first he has to see their lives with his own eyes. In some stories, these nighttime journeys lead him to the poor, strange incidents, family conflicts, crimes, or unexpected human situations. He often accompanied by Jafar, his vizier, and Masrur, his bodyguard, who helps the Caliph during these nighttime adventures. But what's most interesting is that Harun al-Rashid does not always appear in these stories as an all-knowing, perfectly wise monarch. Sometimes he is surprised by what he encounters, sometimes he tests people, and sometimes he had to deal with the consequences of what he has discovered. This fits perfectly into the larger logic of 1001 Nights. A person's status does not guarantee knowledge. A king may not know what is happening in his own city. A wealthy person may not understand the life of the poor. A husband may not know what his wife is doing. A powerful person may fail to notice what an ordinary person can see immediately. And once again, this brings us back to the Scheherazade. Shahryar also believes that he understands women. He passed judgment after experiencing personal trauma and now believes there is nothing left for him to learn. And that's precisely why he falls into Shahrazade's trap. Every night she forces him to encounter a new world, with different people, different personalities, different actions, and completely different destinies. Harun leaves the palace to discover the truth about the subject. Shahryar remains inside his palace, but through Shahrazade's stories, he begins traveling through the lives of strangers. In both cases, power has to stop looking at the world from above, because the person who is convinced that he already knows everything becomes the easiest person to deceive. That's why the nighttime adventure of Harun al-Rashid are not merely exotic eastern scenery and romantic Baghdad imagery. They are another variation of the collection's central idea. If you want to see real life, sometimes you have to take off the crown, even if only for one night. The darkest and most brutal stories in 1001 Nights. The beautiful title 1001 Nights can make it easy to forget just how brutal this collection can be. Modern culture has turned it into an exotic fairy tale of palaces, carpets, genies, and romance, but in the traditional stories, it's death, revenge, infidelity, slavery, violence, cruel punishment constantly exist alongside the wonders. And cruelty here is not an exception, it's built into the world of the stories. A person can lose everything because of a single decision. Wealth can become the cause of a crime. Love can turn into jealousy, and jealousy can turn into a desire for revenge. Men kill because of suspicion. Women use cunning to survive or seek revenge. Relatives betray relatives. And people in position of power can destroy someone with almost no consequences. What's especially interesting in the collection does not offer some simple rule that the good always win and the bad always punishes. Everything is much messier than that. Sometimes the clever person escapes. Sometimes the innocent suffer. Sometimes someone makes a terrible mistake and still gets a second chance. And sometimes a single action sets off a chain of events that can no longer be stopped. That's why 1001 Nights is nothing more like a modern children's fairy tale. It's a world where people are constantly trying to survive in conditions of uncertainty. And when we look at that world through the story of Shahryar, it becomes even more interesting. The most horrifying cruelty of the frame story is not simply the executions. It's the fact that Shahryar stops seeing his victims as an individual people. To him, they become one single category, women who cannot be trusted. But inside Scheherazade's stories, the opposite process takes place. She shows him people one at a time. Here is a person who acted nobly. Here is another who turned out to be a traitor. Here is a woman who deceived someone. Here is a woman who saved someone. A man who became the victim of his own jealousy, and someone who made a mistake and repented. This creates an almost perfect paradox. To stop King, who has generalized all women into one category, Scheherazade tells him a collection of stories in which it's almost impossible to make any universal judgment about humanity. There are too many exemptions, too many contradictions, too many people who behave in ways nobody expects. And that's where the power of the collection lies. 1001 Nights does not say men are bad and women are good. It says something much more uncomfortable. People are capable of being both. They can love and betray, save and kill, show extraordinary generosity, and then become greedy. And if you judge an entire group of people based on the actions of one individual, you will inevitably end up punishing the innocent. This is exactly what Shahryar does at the beginning of the story, and that's exactly what Scheherazade gradually forces him to see. That's why the darkest and most brutal stories in the collection are not simply shocking adventures. They become a mirror for the king himself. He hears stories about other people's cruelty and gradually finds himself forced to compare it with his own. The 1001st Night. How Scheherazade changed the men who killed women. Years pass. Scheherazade continues telling stories and Shahryar continues listening. 1001 Nights is not one long fairy tale, but an enormous chain of stories nested within one another, constantly carrying the listener from one tale to another. But throughout all of this, the most important thing is slowly changing. Shahryar's attitude toward Scheherazade. The woman who was supposed, the woman, the woman who was supposed to become just another victim, survives night after night, and eventually the frame story reaches its conclusion. Scheherazade turns to the king and shows him their children. She tells him that over the years of their marriage she has given birth to sons, and she asks him to spare her for their sake. And this is where the final transformation takes place. Shahryar tells her he had forgiven her long ago, but was any her guilty at all, so he forgive her. Genius. That he had forgiven her long ago, and she had become precious to him and worthy of his respect. The woman he once intended to heal after a single night has now become someone he trusts. But it's important not to turn this ending into an overly sweet fairy tale. Scheherazade did not defeat Shahryar by proving that all women are good. She did something much more difficult. She forced a man who had once turned his own betrayal into universal judgment to spend years listening to stories about all kinds of people. He heard about loyalty and fidelity, love and hatred, greed and generosity, cunning and stupidity, crime and punishment. And gradually his black and white view of the world had to collide with an enormous number of exceptions. At the beginning, Shahryar looks at the women not sees a potential traitor. At the end, he looks at Scheherazade and sees a specific human being, a woman who has become the mother of his children, saved herself, and in process brought end to his bloody habit. And this is where the real scandal of 1001 Nights lies. Scheherazade does not kill the tyrant. She does not overthrow him. She doesn't lead a popular uprising. She cannot simply command him to become a different man. She gains access to his mind and night after night places another story inside it. And while he listens, he has time to see the world throughout something other than his own pain. That's why the ending can be read as a story about the power of storytelling. A man who has convinced that he already knew the truth about women is forced to listen to 1,000 stories before changing his own judgment. And perhaps the most powerful part in that Scheherazade does not save only herself. At the beginning, her marriage means yet another potential execution, but the end, the entire system has come to an end. She turns the night that was supposed to be her last into the first night of a normal story. And that story ultimately proves stronger than fear, authority, and a death sentence. Shahryar began as a man who wanted to control women. Scheherazade ends the story as a woman who can no longer simply as another victim. And that is why the symbol of 1001 Nights is not the gene, not the palace, and not even the 1,000 stories. It's the unfinished story, the story that forces power to wait one more day. If you enjoyed these analyses, make sure to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time. Take care. Bye.